Day by day, little by little, we write the story of our lives. Join author Jo Alch on a walk down memory lane with tenacious humans who didn't let their circumstances dictate their life and what they could become. Welcome to the Lemon Tree Memoirs of Courage podcast.
Good afternoon. I am so honored to have a wonderful guest, a memoir author, Dr. Linda Denke. She has written the book Lost and Found. It's a story of the journey of her son's mental illness, and it's just an honor to have you as my guest. And we're just going to talk about mental illness today, how it's rampant in this country, and there's a stigma attached. And let's just talk about your book. Just get right started. Tell me the story and why you wrote the book.
I wrote the book because I wanted to be part of the solution to begin dissolving stigma. There was a time when I kept this very private and very personal. Only my inner circle knew what I was going through, and you will read the story in the book. And so it's about my son, who was in his last 6 weeks of law school at Loyola in New Orleans, and he had a psychotic break. We were planning a graduation, and the next thing I knew, I was walking into an inpatient psychiatric unit and devastated, you can imagine. And what took place from there is why I have this journey in this book that will be able to tell you how I felt, what it was that I did to cope, how I had my own stigma and bias that I became aware of, and how mental illness can affect your physical health.
Well, and mental illness, my mother had mental illness. She had the borderline personality, histrionic personality. And I know now, but for years I struggled trying to fix her. We did. Our whole family walked on eggshells just to conform with her. We wanted to make sure she stayed calm, and so it is a family illness when someone is diagnosed with such a thing or have the characteristics and symptoms, and you don't know what to do. It is a real private journey and a difficult one. And, I read your book. It's so good and so heartfelt. And just seeing how you were dealing with this alone as a single mother, I cannot imagine what you were going through. It had to have been so difficult. So walk me through when you got the call 6 weeks before graduation. Just tell us about that journey.
When I got the call, I have to say that I got informed as this. The social worker said, I just wanted to prepare you and tell you about your son. Now imagine how I felt. What did that mean? Was he alive? Was he dead? What was and why was a health center calling me? And so I went to see him, of course, had to get off work and I was just in the throes of, is he all right? I had to get my eyes on him. Mm-hmm. And from that time on, I chronicle 5 more hospitalizations of compliance to medicines not working, combinations of medicines with side effects, then him going off the medicine, working for a while, because he did graduate law school. But it was really by a lot of prayer and a lot of resilience and a lot of hardiness on my family's part that kept me shored up and going. I come from a remarkable family, and the support system is crucial to going through any type of unpredictable illness, which this usually comes out of nowhere. My son was 23 years old. And today, after the 5 hospitalizations, he was then homeless because medicines reacted in a way that he just started walking. And he walked from his home here in Dallas through 6 states. And the only way I knew where he was, he got himself to Florida. And the only way I knew where he was and had stopped was because he went against medical advice out of the emergency room, because some kind person or police officer picked him up and took him in for treatment to the hospital emergency room in that particular city or state. So I had phone calls of, we had your son, but he left. And so at least I would know periodically along the way where he was, because he certainly wasn't in his rational mind at that point. Once he got to Florida, which was about 3 months later, and he was hospitalized, because in Florida they have what's called the Baker Act. It was a wonderful act that said if you're diagnosed with a mental illness, which he was somehow able to convey to the officers. He probably was so he lost so much weight, he was fatigued, he had no money, I think he had a driver's license. And so they took him to the hospital. He stayed for almost 2 weeks, and I drove to Florida to get him, or flew to Florida and then drove back with him. And he was still very, very sick because the medicine was new. So as anyone with any kind of condition knows, it takes a while to get the medications right, to get your treatments where they're affecting your body and mind positively, and that you can begin having some normal thinking and you are more rational.
Well, it makes you look at a homeless person and think, okay, what would their life be if they were on the right medication or had the right physician? Most people don't just choose to be homeless. There's a path that happens. I met a physician who was in a car accident, had a terrible head injury, and wound up homeless, lost his practice. His wife walked out on him. He was homeless. And so he had to relearn to do everything. He's never been able to practice again, but it's a pretty amazing story that you never know, what shoes that person is walking. So as far as your son's medication, we were talking about bipolar disorder, and it's not a one size fits all. It's not one medication works for every person with this particular mental illness. So can we talk about that? I know you talked about him being on different medications, and how did you all get to a point, or he get to a point, where the medicines did start working?
That's a good question. I think everyone who is diagnosed with any condition, the medical world tries what is called the critical path. They start with a medication that is normally and is somewhat standardized for generally treating a condition. And then based on how you react, and if you can, begin to speak rationally, some individuals in a few days, others might not, and have to change the medicine. So that's when you have to have your support system in place to pay attention to, are the behaviors getting better? Do you see progress? And the first thing I always say is sleeping. You have to look at whether the individual is getting their full night's rest. Because in mental illness, when a person begins to shorten their sleep cycle, then something is not right. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's my son's number one trigger. He says, I didn't sleep well last night, so I'm going to reduce my stress today. I'm going to eat a better balanced diet. I'm going to begin work a shorter day and things like that. But that comes with time.
Well, and your son is bipolar, and he's functioning. He's an attorney.
Yes.
And so, when somebody just feels hopeless, that their loved one will never, they feel there's no hope. There is hope.
Yes.
And I know in the book you talk about prayer, and that you prayed. And I just prayer is so important in any healing. I know I've had family members that are told, we were told with my grandmother that was so special to me that she had 2 weeks to live, and she wound up living for 11 months, and we enjoyed every single day of that journey, So the doctors don't always know the answers. It's individual, but I do think prayer is just a wonderful dose medication that is so helpful. So why did you write the book? Talk about how did you come up with the title Lost and Found?
Well, I'm the kind of person that just loves words. And I felt like when my son not only went missing or became homeless, then he went missing. So there was no one to notify. The FBI kind of lumps the missing persons together. We have amber alerts. We have silver alerts. I don't ever see anyone's loved one who has a mental illness who was on the road, like my son, and I'm sure many, many mothers have experienced this. There is no one to call. And today it's better, but we have a long way to go.
That would be such a helpless feeling, too, when you just don't know, that fear of the unknown. I don't know how you could sleep.
And that's when my prayer came into play. I ask for prayers. I have a very strong faith. I think that's what makes me who I am. And, as a scientist, I'm a nurse scientist, there is 40 years of evidence that proves that people who have faith of any kind, they practice the better health behaviors, they live longer, and they are resilient to so many things, because whether it's a chronic illness or something tragic that happens, they understand there is a power greater than them. And I believe in intercessory prayer. There's documentation and there's evidence based on that. Physicians have written that. And do you know about 68% of the population that go into surgery every day in this country ask the physician to pray for them? And that is probably something many of us don't know. But I make it my business to know what evidence suggests, because that's my work. And I think we need to pay attention to that is an important strategy in staying well and healing.
That's wonderful. And there is such a spiritual component to healing. Yes. And that is, so when did your book come out? How long has it been out now?
My book came out in Mental Health Month, which was May of 2019. And I have just been overwhelmed with the response. Many of my colleagues know me. They know I am a nurse, and so I have a large network of very supportive people from all walks of life. And then it allows me to have a free conversation about what it is that is so important to me now. This makes my purpose in life. I found my journey. I know who I am, because I want to be an advocate for reducing bias and stigma. And if I didn't write the book, I would be part of the problem, to keep it inside and secret.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's, me with writing about my mother, and it was very healing for me, and it was so hard for me to accept. And I remember, I told you this yesterday when we talked, but a psychologist told me, if your mother had no arms and no legs, would you expect her to be able to cook for you or drive you to school? And I'm like, of course not. And so, mental illness is a handicap. And so that person is not going to be able to do things the way a normal person would. So it is eye-opening. So I know that you're at conferences and you've been speaking. And talk about that. Like, what are you speaking on in these conferences that you're attending?
Well, much of it is beginning to weave together, because many times I've conducted a research study of some kind, and that then is submitted to a nursing conference, and then I go to speak. But more importantly, I think it's because of the work that I'm beginning to put a physical and mental component together and bring that as important to wellness and healing. So sometimes when you speak today, and I guess often with me, individuals will go to the conference, but they will look you up on, on the media or LinkedIn. And I've just had the remarkable opportunities, maybe more than most, to participate in so many awesome. I've done mission work in Africa. I just got back from China to talk about nursing research. And many nurses and non-nurses will approach me and talk about someone they love that has a mental illness right away. Like, hello, my name is, and this is, my son is dealing with this. And, I just wanted to share that with you. So to me, that brings me great joy that the conversation can happen and they know they can come to me and it just flows.
And it's your purpose.
Yes.
So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, I know you talked about, were you on a blog or you have a blog?
No, I don't, but I do get asked to contribute, and I contributed, for example, to a blog actually yesterday because it's Disabilities Month. And I guess it's Mental Illness Week, this week, October 6th through I think it's 14th. And so Mental Illness Awareness. And so I think that's, you can look at the ALSUP blog, ALLSUP, and that's a supplemental insurance for all kinds of disabilities. And, we used to think of when you're mentally ill, you kind of check out. This is good enough. Well, I don't accept that anymore, and you should not either. It's very important to understand that people with mental illness want to work. You ask anyone, once they have treatment, they can be well. They have to be vigilant, and they'll need to manage their illness, but you do the same thing with diabetes. When your sugar gets too high, you know it. You ask for help, and when it gets low, you ask for help. And oftentimes, even when I was a professor and bringing students into the clinical setting, students after I wrote the book would share with me that they were struggling because 1 in 5 suffer from mental illness. So
that's unbelievable.
It's about 23-24% of the population at any given time.
Well, one thing I know, mental health help is expensive, and not everybody can get on Medicaid. And I've heard of stories where parents' savings are depleted because their daughter is in and out of rehab, or there's been some kind of situation, opiate related or alcohol related, or it's just a mental illness. So where can these people turn that know they need medication, they know they need help, but they don't have any money, and their child maybe is an adult child now, is over 21. I mean, what do you recommend that they do?
Well, first of all, these are incredible barriers to overcome, because once someone becomes 21, they're of legal age, and if you're not in your rational mind, you don't want to stop the good feelings from coming from addiction and self-medicating, because you might feel that this is your norm and you're high. So I can't address the addiction problem because that is not part of my book or my expertise, because I did not live that journey. But I do know that my son has spoken to parents in the NAMI group, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, which is the grassroots free peer-to-peer, so you can have counseling that you can get once a week. You can, the counties or parishes will have different resources that you can enlist the services of. The navigation of the mental health care system is the most difficult in this country. And I think until we incorporate it into acute care and emergency care as part of the assessment, and then the behavioral health and psychiatrists are so few, because it's a tough residency as well as a long journey, and we need more of them.
Well, and I worked in a psych hospital when I finished nursing school. I worked in all areas of psych, adolescent psych, and I worked on a dissociative unit with a multiple personality disorder. I worked with drug and alcohol rehab, and I got to work in all areas of the hospital, and it was so eye-opening and so fascinating. The brain is a fascinating organ, and it's just, I got a lot of fulfillment working at the psych hospital. Yes, it was a little scary sometimes, but what I found, so many of these adults with mental illness, they did want help, and they knew they had a problem, and they wanted help. And it's just work. It's like if you're diabetic, like you say, you've got to take your medicine. You've got to eat the right way. If you've got some kind of a mental illness, you've got to walk the walk and work whatever it is that you have to do to stay healthy.
Yes, there is an accountability, and that's not the easy part, because you have to think about it on a daily basis as part of your everyday fabric. And my son is well because of that, and many people are well in this country because their treatment works.
So what advice would you give to someone who has a child or family member that's struggling with mental illness?
I would say that treatment works, and no matter what it takes, you have to, without sacrificing yourself, you have to be able to walk the journey with them and alongside them, and know that your strategies for wellness, eating right, the basic kinds of what we all know, eating right, being supportive, and having compassion. Compassion, I think, is what we lack when it comes to mental illness. We push it aside like it doesn't exist still. It's much better, but we can only make the problem of stigma and bias go away by having conversation about it.
And that's so important. It's, we do need to have conversations. And what's the biggest takeaway with your book, Lost and Found? What do you want the reader to take away from the book?
When I think about the book, I just want, one word comes to mind, I want individuals to know there's hope. And through hope and a journey with hope and faith, anything is possible.
That's awesome. And life isn't easy.
No.
People think, it should be Disneyland all the time, and it's not. And there is strength in that struggle. And God has a purpose for all of us. He's got a purpose for your son. He's working as an attorney. My mother had the most beautiful voice. That was her purpose, was singing. She could just captivate an audience. And so we do all have a purpose. And whatever the journey is, we just work together and support each other. And it does need to be a conversation. So I appreciate your time so much, and I loved your book. I cannot say how much I love the book. It was so good and so enlightening, and I felt I was walking alongside you. And there in chapters, you would pray, and you were so down, and you would just say a 2-sentence prayer, and I could just feel that cry out to God, hold my hand, I can't do this alone. And as a former hospice nurse, you're never really alone. God's always there. So thank you so much, Dr. Denke, for your time. Best of luck with your book. And if people want information about you, they can go to your website. And it's just been incredible. And thank you so much for your time and your story and sharing your story.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on the Lemon Tree Memoirs of Courage podcast, hosted by author Jo Alch. You can find more information on Jo's beginnings and the Lemon Tree at thelemontreebook.com.